the ICI-treated subgroups, 63% had PD-L1 expression of 1% or greater, which is consistent with what we would see in real-world data.
And I know there was some speculation that the wide divergence in the ICI group due to an imbalance of 50% or higher PD-L1 expression, but that was clearly not seen. And I guess the other concern, I know this has been brought up and may be asked later on, is why were so many not measured. Got to remember this study started at a time before PD-L1 testing was standard. Certainly it's never really been standard in the second line.
Great, thank you very much. The second question that comes up is related to the study design itself. Now, in oncology, we're used to the standard of care evolving as trials are going on, and that's certainly what we saw happen here. So can you comment on the shift in standard of care? So as you look at this data set now, and as you think about your patient population in the second line setting, how will you put into context the results from the LUNAR study and the patient that's sitting in front of you that may be eligible for Tumor Treating Fields therapy, whether that's added on to an immune checkpoint inhibitor or docetaxel?
Yeah, I think this study really addresses a population that has limited therapy options in second line and beyond. And so for a patient in second line and beyond, I think of patients that I'm re-challenging with an ICI, and I see this as a strategy that specifically with the ICI treated groups that is still sensitive to immune checkpoint inhibitors without any added toxicities, I would certainly feel very comfortable in adding TT fields to immune checkpoint inhibitors. And I think also with docetaxel, when we think about our approval for docetaxel ramucirumab in 2014 based on the REVEL study, when you think of the median OS there, the median OS for docetaxel is 9.1 months, the median with ramucirumab is 10.5 months, and here we have a median survival that is comparable and numerically slightly better. Again, without added toxicities. If you look at the toxicities for RAM, that certainly is something that is not for every patient. So I think acknowledging that there is a shift in the frontline strategies as we were conducting the study, I think this data is relevant to our patient population, and I do think it really fills in a gap for our patients in second line and beyond.
I can only amplify those comments and further say that this is the first positive trial we've seen in 6.5, 7 years in this setting, in the second line setting, since the advent of the checkpoint inhibitors in second line. I'm going to address the elephant in the room, which is Rebecca Heiss brought this up during the discussion, and I know this has already been asked. Isn't the standard of care changed? That docetaxel is the de facto standard of care, and certainly the differences in the curves was not pronounced there as it was for ICI. That standard of care is in constant evolution. Many of you may not be aware of a trial called S1800A, which is a randomized phase 2 effort done through the NCTN, the cooperative groups that Tiziana and I are both part of, that compared checkpoint inhibitor plus ramucirumab, so essentially checkpoint inhibitor second line after prior platinum and checkpoint inhibitors, essentially the same setting, versus quote-unquote standard of care alone, which was docetaxel. Frankly, majority were docetaxel and ramucirumab. And that study showed that the checkpoint inhibitor in the second line after prior exposure to checkpoint inhibitor had a 3.5, 4-month improvement in median survival, and that's laid the groundwork for a major phase 3 trial that's going to compare those approaches. So the notion that docetaxel is the, quote, standard and is fixed as the standard, I think is fallacious. It is a constantly evolving standard, and I really think, particularly given the results that Tiziana has shown, that this trial may actually have even further relevance as time goes on.
Great, thank you very much for that. I'm going to stay with this topic for a little bit more and dive into a very specific patient population, a question that keeps coming up, and that's related to those patients that were treated with ICI in the first line setting in the ICI plus Tumor Treating Fields therapy arm. There were 3% of patients that were retreated, and in that patient population, how do you think about your patients in the second line that will present to you in the clinic? Will you consider, and your peers consider, Tumor Treating Fields therapy for that patient population?
Yeah, and I think that's a patient population that I would certainly consider TT fields. And we have clinical trial data with that, the Keynote 024 data that used pembrolizumab in frontline, that established the use of frontline pembrolizumab. In that data set, they actually have a subset of patients that were re-challenged upon progression after they completed pembrolizumab monotherapy for 2 years and then had progression. And we saw there that the re-challenge was a successful strategy and led to activity in those patients. However, that benefit the second time around was less pronounced. And here we have the option of adding TT fields, showing that differential improvement in survival there with TT fields plus ICI. So I definitely would strongly consider that for a patient in that setting.
I've shared with you some trial data, my own personal clinical data. I would guesstimate about a third of my patients continue ICIs beyond progression. They may have oligometastases, limited number of sites, or smoldering progression. So this is the perfect opportunity to graft a new modality onto the checkpoint inhibitor, which in my case is almost exclusively pembrolizumab. And Tiziana and I are both involved in multiple studies in the second line, basically looking at other immunotherapeutics, again, grafted onto the frontline checkpoint inhibitor.
Great. Thank you. I'd now like to open up the floor to the audience. If there are any questions here, I see a hand right there. Can we get the microphone over there, please?
Oh, hi. Because this is a novel therapy, consistency and no outliers are important. So in the phase 1, phase 2 trial with TTF plus pemetrexed, survivorship was 57% at 1 year. And in this trial, you clearly didn't get, and the control arm was about what you'd expect, between 30 and 40%. Why didn't the docetaxel arm work?
I don't know that it didn't work. I think the primary endpoint of the study was met. The primary endpoint of the study was overall survival in the ITT population, which included the docetaxel-treated subgroup. Clearly, it didn't meet statistical significance. I think we need to do further deep diving into the data to better understand it. But I think even within the data that we saw, I do see, that there is a benefit there. However, we need to understand if there are subsets there that we're just missing.
It's a small study, the initial phase 1, phase 2, and as you're well aware, the therapeutic landscape is full of studies where the phase 1, phase 2 data don't necessarily match what we see in phase 3. So I'm not terribly surprised, but we still see a numerical advantage that's in double digits. So I agree with Tiziana. I think we need further analysis. We need to look at the nature and of response depending on whether it's infield or outfield, and that's being looked at. I view early stage studies really as hypothesis generating and not as definitive.
Great, thank you. There was a question up front here. We can pass the microphone again.
Hi, this is Nasan from JP Morgan for Jessica Fye. I have a question on the median PFS data that we saw. In light of the OS benefit, but similar median PFS between the arms, were patients treated with TTF beyond progression? And then as a follow-up to that, what were the therapies used post-progression and were they balanced? Thank you.
Great question. So regarding, you're asking the PFS, can you repeat the question about the PFS?
You're talking about the lack of significance in the PFS? Yeah.
So the PFS was similar between the two arms. That discordance with OS is something that we've seen before in other phase 3 trials that have looked at immunotherapy, including Checkmate 057, Keynote 010. So I think ultimately in phase 3 trials, the overall survival is the gold standard endpoint, and here we've met the overall survival. Regarding the tumor treating fields beyond progression, the answer is yes. There were some patients that did receive TT fields beyond progression that were allowed to continue on if they did not have infield progression but had outfield progression. We're still analyzing those numbers and we'll provide more clarity once that analysis is ongoing.
And then I think you asked also about treatment beyond progression, and I think that's also...
Yeah, the post-treatment progression. So about 25% of the patients received treatment post-progression on this study. There were no imbalances between those groups. The majority of patients actually received docetaxel or gemcitabine.
I just want to remind everyone, 057 was one of the positive phase 3 studies in the early ICI era in non-squamous that compared nivolumab to docetaxel. The same general theme, PFS, no benefit, OS, clear benefit. And we've seen that not just in non-small cell, but in mesothelioma, where ipi-nivo seems to have an advantage over standard chemotherapy. No response, no PFS benefit, clear OS benefit. So there's nothing more definitive than survival.
Microphone's coming.
Just a couple for me. Larry Biegelson, Wells Fargo. Congratulations on the study results. The squamous versus non-squamous discrepancy. Everybody's asking about some of the discrepancies. I'll ask that one. Dr. Langer, from your experience, if it works on top of immunotherapy, tumor treating fields in second line, how likely is it to work in the front line setting if it were studied there? And just lastly, for NovoCure, can we get an update on your frontline non-small cell lung cancer strategy, please? Thank you.
Yes, sure. So, we'll start with the histology question first, and then we can go to can the data translate into first line, and then I'll close it off with your question related to our development program.
So with regards to histology, there were no differences there. I don't know that there was not a comparison between non-squamous and squamous. So I don't think there's a discrepancy between the groups, if that's what you were asking.
One was stat-sig and one was not stat-sig, I believe.
The squames definitely had a greater advantage.
Yeah, the p-value there was 0.05. So we didn't compare the two groups.
I think what we ultimately need to do is suss out to what extent the squames were intrathoracic versus metastatic. And again, we're going to have patterns of failure analysis and look at in-treatment versus outfield, infield versus outfield responses. And that may give us some of the hints why there may have been a difference. On the other hand, it could have been serendipity. I'm particularly enthused about combining this with checkpoint inhibitors, both in frontline and in locally advanced. Those studies are ongoing. Remember that our standard of care in treatment-naive, wild-type non-small cell, those without oncogenic drivers, is for 50% or higher Pembro alone, or Keynote 189, Pem-Carbo with Pembro. So here we have data in the second line, particularly with ICI, showing a benefit. I'm quite hopeful that it will translate into frontline. And then in locally advanced, it's basically the same principle. Our standard of care now in patients who are eligible for immune checkpoint inhibitors, concurrent chemoradiation followed by durvalumab. So we're going to be looking at the same question as well, durva plus or minus tumor treating field. So if anything, the phase 3 data in the second line reinforce the leads and the hypotheses that it will be looked at ultimately probably in bigger studies, both frontline metastatic and locally advanced.
Great. So I'm going to circle up on the histology question just to make sure nothing is left to interpretation. So when a patient's sitting in front of you in clinic and they either have squamous histology or non-squamous histology, will you make a decision on whether to use or apply tumor treating fields plus docetaxel or immune checkpoint inhibitor based on their histological status?
Both patients would be eligible for TT fields with systemic therapy. Right. So I wouldn't make a difference based on the histology. Our data doesn't support that. So it would be for all comers.
Thank you. And I will address your question. You're going to hear at the end of this session around our development program. The only thing that I will say is the strength of this data set further fuels our long-term development in lung cancer. So there are several studies that are planned, including taking this now, the benefit that we see in the second line setting and bringing it in the first line setting in the locally advanced disease. And you'll get more information about this in moments to come.
Hi, thanks so much. Jason Benner with Piper Sandler. Doctors Leo and Langer, you're both clearly supportive of TT Fields and use in second-line patients, eligible second-line patients. My first question here, I guess, revolves around really the third question that Pritesh was asking. Just how do you think the clinical community will evaluate the use of TT Fields plus ICI as a second-line option, given that the trial population only had 2%, 3% of patients that were treated with an immune checkpoint inhibitor in frontline, but standard of care today currently requires or often uses immune checkpoint inhibitors as the frontline. So I guess simply, do you think the lack of ICI use in frontline for the TT field population will matter or inhibit clinical uptake?
So I think, when we think about real-world studies in second and third line, and you use claims data or use real-world data, the studies that I've seen in second line and beyond, after chemoimmunotherapy, people are kind of all over the place in what they're selecting to use because docetaxel is ineffective and toxic. And you really see that people are really trying to switch PD-1, PD-L1, add CTLA-4. They're doing a lot of different things, and there's no, in the real world, clear standard second line and beyond therapy. So I think the reality of it is everybody has tried as best as they can continue their patients on an ICI for as long as possible if they're benefiting from it. So in the re-challenge setting, I think in real world, I think this is a strategy that I really do think that clinicians, given how well tolerated it is, no negative impact on quality of life, would go ahead and use TT Fields with ICI, given the benefits and given the lack of other really effective therapies. The duration of response with docetaxel is really short and the toxicities are high. So my answer is yes, I think clinicians will use it. I think people are excited about new treatment modalities, and I think patients are excited about things that are going to help them and are really, interested in novel therapies. So I think it's a matter of educating the clinicians as we get out there and talk about this new technology, this new treatment modality.
Particularly as a modality that does not exacerbate systemic toxicity. I think that came through loud and clear. Obviously, a patient who's treated frontline, say with Keynote 189, and has disease progression within 3 to 4 cycles with rapid systemic relapse, we're not going to expose that person to a checkpoint inhibitor. It's not clear that anything works in that setting. But if they've had at least stability or response, they're out 6 months or 9 months or a year, their disease is smoldering but clearly progressing, they're the perfect candidates.
And sorry, maybe just to follow up on the question, it's more so the lack of the use of ICI in the front line for the TT field population, where I'm wondering if clinicians will look at this and say, we need more data, we need a follow-up study where ICI use in front line is followed up with ICI use or re-challenge with TT fields. Is that going to be a requirement for the clinical community to drive uptake?
And of course, I'm just guessing, and I would say, given the patterns that I see in real-world data for second line and beyond, I would say no, but I do think it's important to get more data in that patient population, and I hope that we conduct more studies in that patient population.
Okay.
I think what's going to happen, particularly as we see studies going forward, is that it'll be, I don't know if it'll be a stratification, but it'll be allowed in the context of additional trials. And you'll probably get that answer, at least in part, because arms of the studies will be balanced. And whether it's ICI plus some other modality versus docetaxel alone again, it'll be reinforced. I don't see how, once, assuming it gets an approval, that it can be accessed out of prospective follow-up clinical trials.
Okay. All right. Thanks. And then the TT fields, or the trial discontinuation for the patients in the TT fields plus, in the experimental arm, I mean, that was higher than kind of the standard of care population. It looked like it was a pretty wide delta. Are you able to elaborate on maybe what drove that discontinuation in that patient population?
I think we need to do further analysis of that data.
I'm not sure I completely understood your question.
The rate of discontinuation,
Rate of
what drove
okay.
discontinuation?
Yeah.
Any hypotheses, I mean, without further analysis?
The median duration was about 15 weeks or 13 weeks for the two groups.
Yeah.
there'll be multiple analyses looking at duration, as well as the daily duration. It's been done with GBM, looking at the number of hours per day and outcome. Those data are still being analyzed.
Okay, thank you.
Any more questions from the audience?
Hi, Emily Bodner from H.C. Wainwright. I was wondering if you can comment at all about compliance of actually wearing the TT fields among the different groups. And then a question for the company. When submitting the PMA, are you looking to just focus on TT fields in combination with checkpoint inhibitors, or do you still think there's potential for approval broadly in the second-line setting?
So regarding adherence and average use of device, we're looking at that in the first 3 months, and also, average use during the hours. Currently, we don't have that data fully analyzed, but I do think that this will be important given that we've seen an association in GBM with that use and then outcomes. So that is something that we're certainly very interested in looking at.
This is going to require, obviously, a fair amount of teaching and servicing of our nurses and advanced practitioners, and frankly, the families. Families can control only two aspects of their loved ones' lives, their dietary intake and to some extent their environment, and certainly what they wear as part of that environment. So this actually gives them a certain degree of agency that they don't have when we're giving systemic agents.
And as to your question related to the regulatory process, so the study overall, the ITT population was positive. That will guide our regulatory approach and the label that we seek. Yes. Can we get the microphone up here, please?
Thanks for taking the follow-up. Just the two for me, for the clinicians. One, have you guys done a per protocol analysis? I assume a per protocol analysis instead of intent to treat. I assume that would be better given the discontinuation rate was higher on tumor treating fields. And second, I know you touched on this a little bit, but there was no progression-free survival benefit, no overall response rate, stat sig. So the question that was emailed to me is the overall survival benefit driven by what patients got post the study. Thanks.
Well, the overall survival and the discordance between the overall response rate and PFS is what we've discussed previously, that we've seen that discordance before in these therapies with ICIs. I would say that given the fact that most of the patients who received post-progression therapy was docetaxel, gemcitabine actually has no survival benefit defined in non-small cell lung cancer. So, I think we need to learn more about the study and these data, but gemcitabine and docetaxel is what they got after. So I don't know that the post-progression therapies necessarily are driving that survival with the information that we currently have.
What you saw today was an intent to treat analysis, not per protocol. And pretty much they matched. I mean, there wasn't that much deviation.
And Dr. Leo, can you comment on the balance between those patients in both arms that received post-progression therapies? I think you commented on that earlier. That data point may be important.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note that it was just a quarter of patients who got therapy post-progression, which again, I think highlights the need to incorporate new therapies as soon as we have them available so that patients can benefit. Like, I definitely agree that having the frontline studies and the locally advanced studies are going to be very helpful addressing the re-challenged population. But for a patient living with lung cancer now, I think this is their time, right? And so if you see that benefit, we have a phase 3 positive study. People are living with cancer and they want a therapy that's novel and better. I mean, I think that this study meets those gaps. And then we just have to follow up on all these important questions.
Great, thank you. Next question. There's a hand up in the back.
Hi, this is Kevin here on behalf of VJ from Evercore. Just to the clinicians, why would the PFS and overall survival dynamics seen in IO trials be relevant here when TTF is a local therapy, given both arms had the same IO?
So I think, one of the mechanisms of TT fields is, as we were talking about, triggering a systemic anti-tumor immune response. So TT fields is delivered local regionally, but we think that perhaps there's systemic effects there given the potential to trigger an anti-tumor immune response. And so within that, that would be one hypothesis of driving that discrepancy.
There may be differential effects both in-field and out-field that may also be driving the discrepancy. There are other effects going on here that, frankly, semi-objective, really subjective OR and PFS don't necessarily catch. Got to remember in ICI-treated patients, we actually have pseudo-progression in anywhere from about 5 to 8%, and yet we have data, for instance, from the OAK trial, which is another one of the critical phase 3 trials, comparing atezo to docetaxel that showed treatment beyond progression in that group translated into survival benefit as opposed to just switching. So there's a lot still going on that we haven't really figured out in the field of immunotherapy.
Great. Let's see any more questions. So we are going to wrap up. I'm going to invite Ashley Cordova, our Chief Financial Officer, to close it out today. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Linger, Dr. Leon-Tesh. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for joining us today. I would like to start with a brief review of our commercial pathway to treating non-small cell lung cancer patients. The presentation of our LUNAR trial results earlier today marks an important step, next up in a round of engagements upcoming. We have already submitted these results for publication in a peer-reviewed journal, and our regulatory teams are preparing both the PMA and CE mark applications for submission later this year. As a reminder, the FDA's review timeline for PMA submissions is 180 days, but that clock is paused for any correspondence between NovoCure and the agency. Once we have gained regulatory approval, our goal is to treat patients as soon as possible while our market access teams take the necessary steps to secure reimbursement. We expect to be treating patients in the later stages of 2024 with commercial and national reimbursement to follow in the coming years. As a part of our clinical strategy, we strive to broaden our labels and expand the eligible patient populations in solid tumors where we have proven efficacy. We have already taken these steps in GBM with our ongoing Trident trial and our upcoming launch of Keynote D58 in collaboration with Merck. And we now have the chance to follow a similar path in the torso. We've been very clear that we do not plan to be one and done in lung cancer. The LUNAR results build upon years of clinical development in thoracic oncology, beginning with our phase 2 EF15 trial and our STELLAR trial in malignant pleural mesothelioma. The results from these trials, together with the profound results of the LUNAR trial, provide a strong foundation for the continued expansion of our lung cancer development program with the goal to treat patients in earlier lines of therapy and together with multiple standards of care. I am very excited to announce today that we have a number of new clinical trials in various stages of design, regulatory review, and launch preparation. These trials will enable us to build upon the efficacy shown in the LUNAR trial with the goal of expanding the pool of patients who can benefit from tumor treating fields. We are planning to launch 3 new trials in lung cancer, aptly named LUNAR 2, LUNAR 3, and LUNAR 4. LUNAR 2 will evaluate tumor treating fields together with immune checkpoint inhibitors and chemotherapy in first-line metastatic disease. LUNAR 3 will focus on patients with locally advanced disease, studying tumor treating fields with immune checkpoint inhibitors following chemoradiation. LUNAR 4 will evaluate the potential of ICI retreatment in metastatic non-small cell lung using tumor treating fields together with an immune checkpoint inhibitor in patients treated with an ICI and chemotherapy in the first line. In addition to these 3 new trials, we continue to enroll patients in our Keynote B36 trial, which is evaluating tumor treating fields with pembrolizumab in the first line. These next series of trials represent an important pattern for NovoCure as we pursue opportunities to expand the addressable market in solid tumors where we have proven efficacy. Beyond lung, we have multiple phase 3s set to read out before year-end 2024. The data from these trials will inform similar opportunities to expand our clinical pipeline. As a reminder, we expect to release data from our phase 3 INNOVATE trial in recurrent ovarian cancer later this year, top-line data from our phase 3 METIS trial in brain metastases from non-small cell lung cancer in Q1 2024, and phase 3 data from our PANOVA-3 trial in unresectable locally advanced pancreatic cancer in the second half of 2024. We expect these 4 foundational trials to drive NovoCure into our next phase of growth as we look to further expand our development pipeline, launch numerous commercial franchises and new indications, and continue exploring opportunities to extend the lives of patients. Building on more than 20 years of research and a strong commercial business in GBM, and with the opportunity to treat tens of thousands of patients on the horizon, we have never been more excited for the future of this company. I'd like to thank you all for joining us here today and welcome you to stop by and say hello to members of our executive team as well as investor relations after this event. As we often do, I would like to close today's session with our mission. Together with our patients, we strive to extend survival in some of the most aggressive forms of cancer through the use of our innovative therapy, Tumor Treating Fields. LUNAR is the first randomized trial in more than 7 years to show a significant extension in overall survival for patients with metastatic non-small cell lung cancer post-platinum. The results hold the potential to make a meaningful difference in the lives of patients who are eager for new, well-tolerated, effective treatments. We look forward to the opportunity to reach these patients and many more in lung cancer and beyond in the coming years. Thank you.